I am Mr. Obsidian. Prepare yourself for the Man of Black.
The following program is rated PG and contains scenes that may not be appropriate for younger viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Well, some wild new video just in tonight from Dulles International Airport. A small motorized police vehicle caught fire in the departures area inside the main terminal. It happened around 7:30 this evening. The area had to be evacuated for a little while. Crews were able to get the fire out. We're told no one, thankfully, was hurt.
At Dulles Airport, Customs and Border Protection officers found more than 28 pounds of cocaine hidden inside packages labeled as hot chocolate. Take a look at this. Officers say they discovered all 10 bricks of the cocaine between layers of coffee grounds and under a double layer of chocolate bars. You can see there. Investigators put the street value at $900,000. It was held for an address in Northern Virginia, but officers eventually released the courier because prosecutors were not able to directly connect that person to those drugs. We're told that the courier then left for Guatemala.
New at 5, Customs and Border Protection agents flexing a bit tonight. They made a major drug bust in Dulles last week. Have a look at this. Yeah, it's 43 pounds of weed that they found in a Houston woman's luggage. They made this discovery on Thursday. How are you going to carry 40?
Maybe she was doing, R&D, research and development.
Well, Customs and Border Patrol, they didn't like it.
They said no.
No, they found it while they were loading her bags up to a flight to Ireland. CBP said those drugs were in a vacuum seal bag, several of them, as you can imagine, and they were wrapped in clothing because that was going to hide it from the x-ray machines. 26-year-old LaKadra Hamilton was arrested and charged with felony possession with intent to distribute. Now, here's the deal. The marijuana has a street value of about 200 grand here in the U.S., but high-quality weed, which we're going to presume this was, can sell for 2 to 3 times that amount more in Europe and in Africa.
Context is key.
Yep.
A California woman has been arrested for allegedly bringing drugs into the country. It happened at Dulles International Airport on Tuesday. U.S. Customs and Border Protection says 27-year-old Taylor Trotloff arrived on a flight from Amsterdam. CBP officers found drugs in her bag that included MDMA, cocaine, ketamine, and marijuana. Trotloff was arrested by MWAA police. She is facing felony narcotics possession charges, and her global entry membership was revoked. Now, officials there are praising 2-year-old Cincos, the dog here, for making the bus. Look at him, he's so...
You don't want to mess with that dog.
He's like, I just showed up to do my job. The narcotics dog alerted officers, who then searched Trotloff's suitcase.
So regal.
WJZ continues to follow the breaking news at Dulles International Airport in Northern Virginia. Police are investigating a suspicious vehicle on an upper-level roadway. Now, here is a live picture from the scene provided by WJLA. Traffic is being detoured, and the investigation area does include some areas in the terminal. According to an airport spokesperson, a canine may have detected something. WJZ will keep you updated on this breaking news story.
The CIA's secret mind control experiments are back in the spotlight. Newly released documents reveal details about MK Ultra, a 1950s program using LSD and hypnosis to study behavior control. Pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly reportedly supplied large amounts of LSD for that project. Some tests were done on unsuspecting Americans, including prison inmates. National Security Archive, marking 50 years since the program's exposure, compared the research to Nazi experiments and criticized the lack of accountability.
The George Bush Center for Intelligence is the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, located in Langley, near Washington, D.C. It was the world's largest intelligence headquarters from 1959 until 2019, when it was surpassed by Germany's Bundesnachrichtendienst headquarters. The Central Intelligence Agency was created on July 26 in 1947, when President Harry S. Truman signed the National Security Act into law. Before its current name, the CIA headquarters was formerly unnamed. The original headquarters building was designed in the 1950s and it contains 130,000 square meters of floor space. The ground was broken for construction on November 3, 1959, with President Dwight D. Eisenhower laying the cornerstones. The building was finally completed in March 1961. The center is located at 1000 Colonial Farm Road in McLean, Virginia, and can be reached via George Washington Memorial Parkway. However, due to a need for secrecy, the complex may only be accessed by those with authorization or by appointment. Only authorized vehicles may access the private road leading to the complex from George Washington Memorial Parkway. The location of the building was led to the name Langley, being used as a colloquial metonym for the CIA headquarters, despite the presence of other non-CIA related government buildings in the community of Langley. The CIA Museum, also known as the National History Collection, is located within the center. The museum holds declassified items such as artifacts associated with the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, and other foreign intelligence organizations, including historical spy gadgets, weapons, and photographs. As it is located within the CIA compound, it is not accessible by the general public.
People refer to the CIA headquarters as Langley, Virginia. And that's funny because the actual city it's in is Langley, Virginia, but at headquarters we never call it Langley. We call it headquarters. Even in our written traffic, we refer to it as headquarters, or HQS. It's technically two buildings, what we call an old headquarters building and a new headquarters building. And that's the only overt, non-classified building that I'm able to disclose. There are several buildings that belong to CIA, that house CIA officers, but they're all still covert in nature and their locations are not something that I can disclose. We really are a self-contained unit, almost like a terrarium, where we don't need any support from outside. We can do everything within the confines of CIA, which is exactly how CIA wants to operate because they have to be so heavily compartmentalized. CIA is a massive city on its own. It's got its own food, its own water sources, it's got its own industry inside. The land that headquarters is on is a large lot of land with a massive parking lot that wraps around it. In fact, it's the parking lot that most people complain about because it's a huge parking lot, and for you just to get to your office, it's often a 15 or 20-minute walk through this winding, massive parking lot just to get to your office. The size of the parking lot and the way that it's laid out is very much based on security. They don't want cars to get within a certain distance just in case one of the cars or a CIA asset is compromised. Unfortunately, it's not a totally rare occurrence for a CIA officer to be compromised to some sort of adversary or enemy. So they keep cars a certain distance from building walls in case there's a car bomb.
Very excited to be joined this morning by John Lisle. He is a history professor at the University of Texas, but more importantly, for our purposes this morning, he's the author of a brand new book on the history of MK Ultra. Let's go ahead and put that up on the screen. Book jacket, Project Mind Control, Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA, and the Tragedy of MK Ultra. And John joins us now. Great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. It's a wild story, to say the least.
Yeah, of course. So give us, let's start from the beginning. What is the context, the geopolitical context in which MK Ultra is launching, and just give people a little reminder of what this was all about?
Yes, so MK Ultra was the CIA's project to determine whether mind control is possible. Is it possible to give someone a drug that might be used as a truth serum in an interrogation to get them to tell the truth? Is it possible to control someone's behaviors and beliefs? That was the kind of the goal of MK Ultra, and the reason this started in 1953 is because right at the end of World War II, especially after the development of the atomic bomb, proximity fuses, radar, science was starting to be seen as integral to national security. And during the Korean War, there were several American POWs who were captured, and they confessed to things that they didn't do. They confessed to conducting biological warfare against Korea, dropping anthrax and typhus and cholera and bubonic plague. And the question within the CIA was, why are they confessing to these false charges against them? And one concern was that perhaps the communists have developed some method of mind control, whether it be hypnosis or drugs. And so if that were possible, the CIA wanted to determine how can we defend against that, or how can we offensively use something like that? The mind control might be the next arms race, and we want to stay ahead of the communists. Therefore, we're going to start this program, MK Ultra, to see what we can do.
Yeah, and it seems like they really took this as like an existential threat. You know, it kind of reminds me actually a little bit of the way that our government talks about AI now, where there's this sort of like AI development race in the sense that whichever country between us and China wins the AI race is going to own the future and own the future of warfare as well. So talk a little bit about how that sort of existential mindset informed the extreme and wildly unethical nature of the experiments, the human experiments that they conducted here.
Pretty quickly within MK Ultra, one of the main drugs that they started using was LSD. It had been discovered in 1938, but then really realized what it was in 1943. So it was a pretty new drug and extremely potent. And the existential part especially came with LSD because it's such a powerful hallucinogen, and so such a finite dose can have such a profound effect. The worry was that if some foreign power wanted to dose a city's water supply, let's say with LSD, maybe they wouldn't need that much of it. And so that was the concern about the existential threat, and why MK Ultra went to the lengths it did in many cases to determine whether that would work. Some of the things that MK Ultra was involved in was dosing unwitting people with LSD to see how they would react. Again, because if the Soviets, let's say, were to dose a city with LSD, we want to know how to defend against that and how to deal with people who have been surreptitiously dosed with this drug. So MK Ultra personnel like Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the program, he would dose unwitting people with LSD to monitor their behaviors to determine what kind of effects this would have on them. This, in several cases, led to tragic consequences. The most famous person whom this happened to was Frank Olson, who was dosed with LSD at a retreat with Sidney Gottlieb, and he ended up kind of having a psychotic break. His wife didn't understand like what his mind state was after that, and a few days later he jumps out of a hotel window and dies.
So are you of the opinion that he did jump out of that window? Because there is some dispute, including from the family, who had his body exhumed, and further analysis indicated he may have had blunt force trauma before he ended up out of the window. And, you know, at the time, he wasn't just some random unwitting subject. He was one of them and knew a lot of, you know, the secrets of what they were doing, all these, you know, sensitive national security information. So I know there's long been skepticism about the, you know, the events surrounding his death.
Yes, there has been. In fact, Frank Olson's own son, Eric Olson, is one of the main proponents of the idea that his father was murdered by the CIA, potentially because Frank Olson was involved in what was called the airborne distribution of pathogens. How is it possible to create weapons that we can use, you know, anthrax or germ bombs, and how is that going to spread in the air? That's what Frank Olson was working on. And so Eric Olson and some others who were of the opinion that he was murdered think that maybe Frank Olson started to have moral compunctions about what he was doing, and maybe he was going to expose it, and so the CIA had to get him out of the way, and so they threw him out of this hotel window. I don't think that's the case. In fact, you know, you mentioned that they had his body exhumed and analyzed to determine whether there was this blunt force trauma. David Starrs led that process, and he did determine that he thought there might have been some blunt force trauma before Frank Olson went out the window. However, there were several people on Starrs' team who negated that conclusion and said that Starrs was someone who kind of sought the spotlight and made things a little bit more sensational than we would have, and so we don't think that's the case. In fact, they said they thought it was consistent with his head hitting the window on the way out. So I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that Frank Olson was murdered. There are several other people who were victims of MKUltra who had very similar symptoms to him. They've been dosed unwittingly with LSD, and they ended up in psychiatric institutions for the rest of their life. So I think it's more likely that he had that same kind of psychotic break that several other people who were victims of this did as well. So
what was your motivation to write the book now? I know there were newly discovered documents, depositions that really got to the heart of some of the inner thinkings of people like Sidney Gottlieb. So talk about a little bit of what's new and what you were able to uncover here.
Yeah, thank you, because that's the really exciting part of this book is the fact that the basis for it is these depositions I found as part of a lawsuit in the 1980s. There were several victims of MKUltra who sued the CIA. That lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, but as part of the lawsuit, the lawyers representing the plaintiffs, Joseph Rao, James Turner, famous civil rights attorneys, they took the depositions of dozens of people who were involved in this case, dozens of the perpetrators like Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, Richard Helms, the head of the CIA eventually, and they took several depositions of the victims of MKUltra. Since this lawsuit was settled out of court, the depositions just kind of stayed in the papers of Joseph Rao until he passed away, and those were donated to the Library of Congress. And I was rooting around in there, and I happened to find these depositions, thousands of pages of verbatim transcript of him asking the perpetrators and victims of MKUltra what they did, what they went through. So it's so exciting for a historian because I can actually use dialogue now because I have dialogue between these attorneys and these deponents. Usually in fiction, you get to invent dialogue. In history, you don't invent dialogue, and so you can't really have that exciting part of getting into the heads of the characters as well. But now with these depositions, that's exactly what I have. So that was one of the main catalysts for wanting to write this book. I had so many great verbatim transcripts, thousands of pages. In fact, Sidney Gottlieb's transcripts of his depositions run to over 800 pages alone. So I have 800 pages of him talking about exactly what he did.
What do you think is the cultural legacy of MKUltra? And I mean, I just was thinking about, I know this is something you've thought about as well. There's a lot of wild conspiracy theories out there at this particular time. I think this happens anytime there's sort of a breakdown in institutional trust. But also when you look back at our own history and you look at the government doing things like this, it's like, oh, well, I mean, you can't put anything past them. They'll do wild, mind control experiments to try to create assassin animals and, and try to mind control random unwitting subjects, prostitutes dosing their clients and even some of their own, specialists getting unwittingly dosed, et cetera. So it's hard to put anything past them when you have such an incredibly wild and proven conspiracy that is lurking in the background.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's such a good point because MKUltra really opens the door for a lot of conspiracy theorists to latch onto it for a few reasons and to say, oh, well, if the CIA was doing something so crazy in the past and so patently unethical. In fact, the CIA's own Inspector General in 1963 said that this was illegal and unethical. So that's coming from the CIA itself. Right. So the fact that the CIA did something like that, it leads the conspiracy theorists to say, if they did that, what else must they be doing today? And there are a few reasons why MKUltra in particular is suited towards this kind of conspiratorial thinking. One reason, like you just mentioned, is because it is just so absurd that it opens the door for any possibilities. The other is because in 1973, Sidney Gottlieb, the head of this program, he retired from the CIA, as well as Richard Helms, the director of Central Intelligence, and they decided when they retired to destroy the MKUltra files, at least most of them. They didn't get all of them. There were thousands of pages that still survived. But the act of that destruction, the fact that they incinerated these files, really opened a Pandora's box because now anyone can say, well, we can't know exactly what MKUltra was in total because we don't have those files. Therefore, maybe they were doing this or maybe they were doing that. The fact that we don't have those files really opens the Pandora box for anyone filling in the record with their wildest imagination. And that has led a lot of conspiracy theorists to argue that, well, maybe MKUltra was involved in trafficking children, or maybe it was controlling celebrities like Britney Spears. Now that the Pandora's box is open because those files are destroyed, anyone can say anything about the program. However, I don't think that's a great mode of argument because it's kind of ironic, but we almost know more about MKUltra than almost any other secret project. It seems counterintuitive because a lot of these files were destroyed, but we have so many files and sources on MKUltra. We have thousands that actually survived. We have the memoirs and interviews of people who were involved in this. We have thousands of pages of depositions that I found. We have institutional records that have been released since. We have government reports. We have the Rockefeller Commission, Church Committee, Pike Committees, these congressional and executive committees that were set up in 1974 and 5 to investigate these past abuses. So we have so much material about MKUltra. I actually think that we can know a good deal of what it was, and even better, we can know so much about it that we can know what it wasn't. And it wasn't something that trafficked in child sex slaves or whatever the conspiracy theorists are saying.
All right, John, tell people where they can find the book.
You can find it in bookstores, wherever, hopefully.
All the places.
At any good bookstore, it'll be there. You can find it online, and I appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show, ad-free, and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.
Did you get a chance to look at that Chaos book that I told you about?
Yeah.
Tom O'Neill, who is a friend of my good friend Greg Fitzsimmons, wrote an insane book that took him 20 years about Manson and the CIA and LSD. And what did you think about all that?
Well, you've touched on some. I mean, or Tom touched on some really interesting things. And what I liked about his book, and I went through it, I read it, is that he's actually, I think, very honest about the shortcomings, right, of what he ended up doing, right, and the research that he went through, and where he couldn't draw connections. So I give him a lot of credit. I think it's well worth the read, and you know, it's a hell of just a personal story that it took him this fucking long, right, to make his way through, in a variety of reasons, but.
Luckily, it's been a tremendous success.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really he's sold out almost immediately, and the paperbacks are sold out too. I mean, I think they're reprinting it.
It's a huge draw, right?
It is
that,
but it's also it's a fantastic account of all the things that happened with the Manson family and all those people that were alive back then, about how this guy kept getting out of jail, and they kept arresting him, and they kept saying this is above my pay grade, and they would let him out.
Yeah, and that's for me, that's the strangest part about the whole story, right? I mean, this idea that was Manson a lab rat for the CIA, and how far down that rabbit hole do you want to go? Well, O'Neill is pretty clear about that, right? That's not a particularly solid connection. It's a tenuous connection, I think he called it, between one of what used to be a contractor, a researcher for that old chestnut MK Ultra,
Jolly West.
Yeah, Jolly West. Yeah.
What did you think about all that? Like, I'm sure you know about Operation Midnight Climax and all the stuff that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to know how many people are aware. I mean, I know some people that that's what they do.
Midnight Climax. Yeah. Operation Midnight Climax was a CIA-funded program where they dosed up Johns. They created brothels and dosed up Johns with LSD against their knowledge.
Yeah.
And without their knowledge, and let them fornicate and have a good old time with these ladies of the evening.
Man,
and,
my God.
And watch them and film them and study them.
I know. When you say it that way, I'm in. If you want money to produce that movie, but it's it is actually it's true. Look, it fell under the sort of umbrella of this MK Ultra, which is public knowledge. I'm not, obviously we're not talking that term.
But let's also give them the benefit of the doubt. When LSD was synthesized by Albert Hoffman, they really needed to figure out what the fuck this was, and they need to figure out, like, could this be used against Americans? Could this be used against the president? Like, what is this? Is this a truth serum? Like, what are the benefits? What's the pros and cons? And what are the dangers of this stuff?
Well,
and from a national security angle, it's very important that they did study it.
Right, and so from context, and again, we talked about that towards the beginning, is which is something we don't normally do, right? So we're judging people from history now,
right.
And so we're not using context of, well, what was the what were the conditions?
We're talking about the 1950s, the 1960s.
Well, or, late 40s even. Right. I mean, so what have you got? You got the end of the World War II. You got the Cold War. It's the late 40s. You got the Soviet Union. That is heavily invested in a variety of experiments. Mind control, brainwashing was the sort of the term of the culture, right? And brainwashing was a big issue. Not a big issue, but it captured people's imagination back then. So the late 40s, early 50s, it was Korean War. We had an existential threat, right? We had nukes pointed at each other. We had drills in schools, kids hiding under desks. I mean, what the fuck? So with the fear that the Chinese or the Soviets were going to develop mind control abilities, was pervasive, and I know you talk about it now, and everybody rolls their eyes and goes, "Oh my God!" But you're absolutely right that you have to understand the context with which then Allen Dulles, who was at the time the director of the CIA,
by the way, the guy who Kennedy fired,
yes,
and wound up being a part of the Warren Commission after Kennedy was murdered, which was very strange.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I like that. I like where that could go. So anyway, we got Allen Dulles, who in early in 53, says, "All right. We have to understand what the Soviets are doing, particularly the Soviets. But we also had, again, I'm sure some folks listening know all this, but a lot of folks probably don't. We had POWs returning, American POWs returning from Korea. That was a big issue, right? Because some of them came back, again, quote unquote, brainwashed, and some of them didn't want to return because, again, brainwashing, mind control that, perhaps the Chinese had developed these techniques. So initially the idea was defensive. How do we protect ourselves against this new threat within this Cold War, against these enemies who appear to be devoting a great deal of resources against this? Well, so initially it started out as a defensive effort. MK Ultra was the umbrella name for a whole bunch, over 140 projects, sub-projects underneath MK Ultra. And it was all based around chemical substances, use of chemicals, use of drugs, behavioral issues with human beings, creating false memories, deleting memory, influencing the behavior, again, of individuals. There were a variety of projects that fell under this MK Ultra, and it was, again, starting out as a defensive issue, but then quickly became sort of an offense. How do we become the leader in all of this? Which is typical, right? It's typical in how things develop. It's like cyber warfare. Initially it's defensive, and now you think, okay, now we got to figure out how to make it work on our behalf.
And sometimes it's important, like when they shut down the Iran nuclear program with a virus, essentially a computer virus.
No, absolutely. And where this went off the rails in a handful of ways, in many ways. was testing on unwitting subjects, things such as LSD and a variety of other substances. Yeah, whoops. And those subjects, unwitting subjects, ranged everything from in federal prisons to state mental hospitals.
And that's where Manson comes in.
And that's where Manson comes in, and a variety of other people. Who I would recommend people dig in. Don't settle on just one account. And one of the things that people should also do if they want to read about this is read any testimony that came out of the CIA. And there was some testimony. There were documents written by the Inspector General back in, and this time period was about 53 through at least officially acknowledged 1964. And then the program was wrapped up. Supposedly there were still federal programs, military programs, others that were still looking into issues related to the use of chemical substances for everything, again, from interrogation to behavioral adjustment. And a lot of these things were funded through cutouts. So you'd set up, again, this is early 50s, mid 50s, early 60s, set up financing vehicles, through, say, what appear to be non-threatening grant programs, from research institutes. So you'd loop in academic institutions or researchers. And MKUltra had, at least acknowledged anyway, over 80 academic institutions and others that were either wittingly or unwittingly working on their behalf in various research programs. So yeah, this Midnight Climax program, basically they'd kit out a safe house as a brothel, and they would have the hookers slip LSD or whatever substance to the johns, and then behind a mirror, you'd have like a researcher, right? And this is where it got weird. Sitting there, having a drink and watching these, the hooker and the John have sex, and then they'd be analyzing the impact of the LSD on them in terms of their ability to talk, and would they...
Was the hooker in on it?
Yeah, the hooker was in on it. And
was she an employee of the CIA?
And it wasn't just the agency, like the Army was involved in these things as well. But they would get, cash payments, and oftentimes the get out of jail free card.
Ladies, if you're out there.
Yeah, if you're out there.
Listen to me.
Come on.
Whatever you need.
Come forward.
I'm here for you.
But
there was on the show. Let's talk. You can wear a Boba Fett mask. Okay, we'll hide your identity. I don't know why I said Boba Fett.
But just imagine. So it's okay. So this was clearly, was off the rails, right?
Yeah.
And they had one of the guys that was involved in this. He was with what used to be called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. A guy named George White. Was involved in like the San Francisco cat house, and according to the stories, he'd sit there with a martini in his hand and watch the couple have sex, and then he would have like prepped the hooker to say, okay, after sex, now this appears to be the best time to get them talking, so ask them about their job and let's see if they'll talk about their job. The idea being, could we influence and entrap potential assets overseas for operational reasons? Was there some use for operational purposes? But basically it was just George getting his rocks off, watching couples having sex, and very, very strange shit. But you're right in that. And so again, this went on until 64. MKUltra, interestingly enough, not to spend too much time on it, but Richard Helms was the director at the time in the early 70s. And he and a guy named Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of technical services at the agency, they agreed that the smart thing to do in 73, before Richard Helms left and Gottlieb left the agency, was to destroy all the records. So they purged all the records of MKUltra that they thought existed. This was investigated in the Church Committee back in 75. And then 76, I think it was, they found a bunch of financial records, that had not been purged because they'd been kept, audits of, and again, you're talking about like 149 sub-projects of MKUltra. So you can imagine each sub-project has its own accounting, and you got to turn in your receipts for the LSD that you bought or the hooker you paid off or whatever, so here's my receipt, can I have my $12 or whatever you paid for the hooker back then. And so, probably not $12, but they found some financial records, and so that became then a matter of another investigation up on the Hill. And Stansfield Turner, at the time the CIA director, testified at that point. And that's why I brought my laptop, is because Stansfield Turner's testimony is actually pretty interesting as far as MKUltra goes. And he talks about, we've attempted to group the activities covered by the 149 sub-projects into categories under descriptive headings. Right, wouldn't you? In broad outline, at least, this presents the contents of these files. The headings of the categories of all these various projects that ran under MKUltra, and this gives you a pretty good quick sense of what they were doing at the time. Research into the effects of behavioral drugs and/or alcohol. There were 17 sub-projects probably not involving human testing. This is a testimony from the director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner. 14 sub-projects definitely involving tests on human volunteers. 19 sub-projects probably including tests on human volunteers. While not known, some of these sub-projects may have included tests on unwitting subjects as well.
While not known?
Well, not known. And then 6 sub-projects, definitely involving tests on unwitting subjects. Research on hypnosis, acquisition of chemicals or drugs, aspects of magician's art. What?
Magician's art?
Yeah, like slipping him a Mickey or something. How do you do that? Sleight of hand. studies of human behavior, sleep research, behavioral changes during psychotherapy, motivational studies, studies of defectors, assessment and training techniques, polygraph research, funding mechanisms for MK Ultra external research activities, research on drugs, toxins, and biologicals in human tissue, activities whose subjectives cannot be determined from available documentation. Anyway, it goes on, but it gives you a sense of what the hell was happening during this period of time. But again, this doesn't justify it. Obviously it doesn't. But you're absolutely right that to have a full understanding of this, you have to look at the context of where we were at that time. And where we were was smack dab in the height and elevation of the Cold War, knowing that our adversaries, our existential threats, were engaged in this sort of behavior. Now, George White was not really a researcher or anything. He would just sit behind a mirror watching some people, get off. So clearly, and all the unwitting subjects involved. I mean, but look, they were slipping LSD to agency employees, right, without telling them.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's just. Yeah, so
it's not that long ago, but
not.
We have to think about it in terms of the same way we thought about Abraham Lincoln. That in the context of the times, this wasn't such a horrendous thing to do. They didn't know any better. It was really, they didn't know what these substances would do to people, and there wasn't a lot of ways to find out. The Harvard LSD studies that they did, that they believe in part were responsible for the Unabomber. There's a lot of other shit that was responsible for the Unabomber, including particularly his childhood. But they did a lot of these studies because they didn't know. I mean, it's one way to find out. I mean, how do you get responsible human subjects? How do you get people to do? Well, there's not a lot of ways other than just test people.
Right. And unfortunately, yeah, what this ended up being was, like using the most marginalized people out there, like sex workers or prisoners or whatever.
Right.
And oftentimes, Johns or just but that whole thing. But where Tom O'Neill's book is really interesting in a couple of ways is if you jump. So MK Ultra kind of finished up in '64 officially, right? That's when the Inspector General came out from the agency and said, "This you can't do this." They had a new Inspector General and they looked and said, "This is clearly not where we are supposed to be." But interestingly, funding mechanisms that were used to dole out grants or to provide a cutout between government and research that was being done. Did some of those continue to exist for other programs, other research? And in '67, you have the Summer of Love, San Francisco, and Tom O'Neill writes about this, and it's very, very interesting. But you had the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, right, which in part was running a couple of projects that were supposedly getting funding from the National Institute for Mental Health, which had previously been a funding mechanism also for MK Ultra, a few years in the past. And Roger Smith was a guy who was getting his PhD in criminology. He was working at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, and he was also Manson's parole officer. And to your point, Manson was like a brook trout or a rainbow trout that is in some catch and release stream, right? He was constantly arrested during the '67, '68 period. Remember, the killings happened in August of '69, and he kept getting released. And he had been in prison, right? In '67, early in that year, he'd been released from prison, right? So he was on probation. Any violation, certainly some of the things he was getting arrested for, should have sent him back to prison, but he wasn't. So that, to me, is one of the most interesting parts of the book, is this revolving door that Manson was in. And eventually we all know what happened to him. But yeah, working at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, that's where Manson would go, along with some of his followers. And they were, part of a study, and, they were, I'm sure, getting their LSD from there. But also, this guy Jolly West, who was involved in MK Ultra, also ended up having an office at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. So, but again, to Tom O'Neill's point,
that clinic closed down about 4 months after Tom's book came out. Been open for over 50 years.
It's crazy. Yeah.
What are the odds?
Yeah, I know. What are the odds? I didn't see that coming. Yeah, but I mean, again, I like the book because he does seem to be trying to let the facts of all his research lead the way, rather than trying to prove a point that he comes up with at the beginning of his book.
Well, he also exposed the prosecutor, Bugliosi, and all the issues that was going on with him that led to him wanting to follow the narrative that they had laid out, that Manson was trying to incite a race war and, and ignore all the other indicators that there was some deeper connections.
And yeah, was Manson was he an informer for the Bureau or for local law enforcement or some other outfit? That's
hard to tell.
Hard to tell, but it's compelling in light of the fact that he kept getting released. He seemed to have a get out of jail free card.
He also seemed to have an unlimited supply of acid. That was what's fascinating. And he also seemed to employ the same techniques that apparently the CIA had employed when they had done experiments on prisoners, including the fact that he would, force them into weird sexual situations and pretend to take LSD himself, but not really participate, and then, influence them. And he seemed to be doing things to them in terms of trying to alter their behavior and getting them to do things that were outside the norm, including murder.
Yeah, I mean, did he see Yeah. Did he have a sense from his time there at the clinic or dealing with what's his name, Roger Smith, his parole officer, who again was also criminology doctoral candidate, I guess, and so was But look, Manson was he was not a rocket scientist. He was illiterate for the most part, right? Until he ended up in prison and maybe.
Which is why it was so weird that he was able to manipulate so many people so well.
Right.
But it was also he was the perfect guinea pig. I mean, you're talking about a guy who spent half his life in federal penitentiaries.
Yeah, and also you're putting it in context of the time. What else did you have going on? You had sort of this awareness of the impact of LSD on the counterculture, right? So you had federal agencies like the Bureau, for example, worrying about, oh my God, what's what are these hippies going to do next? Right. They were worried obviously about the Black Panthers, but it was also more than that. It was the
anti-war movement.
Yeah, just the general counterculture and the impact of drugs on it, and so. It's a fascinating. I think it's a very interesting read, and I think it's worth the read because again, he's spent so much time trying to make his way through
20
and get this
years.
book. Yeah,
it's a crazy story. And
what you, bro? What the heck? You tripping, bro? You tripping?
Who's in the box? What's in the box? What's in the box?
I am Mr. Obsidian. Prepare yourself for the Man of Black.